Classifying incoming funds, offered by the Office of Sponsored Projects. Types of incoming funds. The Smithsonian receives funds via a wide assortment of external funding mechanisms, including gifts, grants, cooperative agreements, sponsored project contracts, interagency agreements. Properly classifying funds is important, as SI is required to manage funds in accordance with applicable laws, Smithsonian directives, IRS regulations, accounting, and audit standards. Why is this so important? Properly classifying an agreement for incoming funds is important because it determines who at Smithsonian needs to be involved in the documentation and management of the funds, determines what fund the money is deposited to and where expenses are incurred, determines the accounting handling and when SI recognizes revenue, determines what costs can and or must be included in the funding. It impacts what audits the funding is subject to. Gifts. SD 809 Philanthropic Financial Support governs the solicitation, acceptance, and recognition of certain gifts to the Smithsonian. Gifts support the SI mission and can be designated for general support or restricted in use to a particular program or project. Other than a use restriction, gifts are a no-strings-attached donation to SI. Managing gifts. Gifts are managed by the Office of Advancement and Unit Advancement staff. Funds are deposited in an 801 account. Unit directors review and approve gifts to the unit. Grants. SD 318 Externally Funded Sponsored Projects defines a grant as a legally binding agreement with a corporation, foundation, or government to provide financial support for a specific program, project, or activity. A grant is awarded by an organization to further its mission and objectives. Grants are awarded as a form of assistance and require recipients to use their best efforts. Grants typically include in their terms a period of performance, return of unspent funds at the grant end, spending consistent with an approved budget, approval for deviations from the project plan or budget and other requirements, financial reporting requirements, performance reports. Not all elements are in every agreement. Even one can make the funds a grant. Cooperative agreements. SD 318 Externally Funded Sponsored Projects also defines cooperative agreements. Cooperative agreements are an arrangement between the Smithsonian and a government entity, whether federal, state, local, or foreign, where the entity will have an active and substantial participation in the project, or when its procedures warrant the use of a cooperative agreement rather than a grant or contract. Cooperative agreements often come with terms that are similar to a grant and are classified as a grant in the Smithsonian's financial system. Sponsored project contracts. SD 318 Externally Funded Sponsored Projects includes the definition for sponsored project contracts. Sponsored project contracts are legally binding procurement agreements between the Smithsonian and another party to pay the Smithsonian for goods or services. They provide financial support for a specific program, project, or activity, in return for which the Smithsonian agrees to provide project results to the sponsor. They can be entered into with a corporation, foundation, government, or other entity. A sponsored project contract is not donative in nature, but is a mutually beneficial arrangement by which the sponsor supports a project with the expectation of benefiting from or receiving its results. Examples of results are research data, copies of publications, an exhibit, or a piece of equipment. Interagency agreements. Interagency agreements are covered in SD 318, Externally Funded Sponsored Projects, and SD 319, Incoming Interagency Agreements and Transfers. SD 318 defines an interagency agreement as a cost-reimbursable agreement between two or more participants in an ongoing business relationship, including but not limited to agreements between agencies and assisted acquisitions. In the sponsored projects context, these are agreements where a federal agency funds the costs of the Smithsonian for carrying out a project or program for the benefit of the agency. Federal staff salary and benefits can be included in the costs. This is the only type of funding where this is allowed. Accounting classification of agreements. The various types of agreements SI receives are classified as contributions and exchanges for accounting purposes. This is important because it determines how revenue is recognized on our financial statements. If incorrectly classified, SI might have an audit finding or need to undertake significant effort to correct the accounting. Grants and cooperative agreements equal unconditional or conditional contribution. Contracts equal exchange. IAA equal exchange. Managing grants, cooperative agreements, sponsored project contracts, and interagency agreements. The Office of Sponsored Projects manages these types of incoming funding. All proposals need to be coordinated with OSP before submitting. OSP is exclusively authorized to sign these agreements for the Smithsonian. Funds for grants, cooperative agreements, and sponsored project contracts are placed in 802 private funds and 803 government funds accounts. U.S. government grants and cooperative agreements are subject to an audit under 2 CFR 200 annually, which is managed by OSP. For private grants, OSP works with advancement at all stages to manage the grant. IAA funds are managed in conjunction with the Office of Finance and Accounting, which determines the fund type for the account. The source of the funds can help identify the correct classification, but isn't conclusive. Federal government could be grant, cooperative agreement, contract, or IAA. Other government could be grant, cooperative agreement, or contract. Foundation could be gift, grant, or contract, but that is rare. Corporation could be gift, grant, or contract. And funds from an individual could be gift. Pass-through or flow-through funding. What's that? Another organization partners with you on a proposal submission to do the project together. They submit as the prime recipient, and you are identified as the subrecipient. Your scope of work and budget are included in their proposal. If the project is funded, the prime organization then passes part of the funding to SI through a separate agreement. The award terms that the prime must follow are passed through to SI as the subrecipient. This award is classified based on the type of award the prime organization received. For example, private university submits a proposal to the National Science Foundation on behalf of the university and includes a portion of the work and funds for SI. They receive a grant and issue a subaward to SI. We classify that funding as a grant and categorize it as government funds due to the source, NSF. Overhead, or indirect costs, considerations for grants, cooperative agreements, contracts, and IAAs. The type of sponsor and the type of award determine what kind of overhead to charge. For government, use SI federally negotiated rates. For private, use SI established rates subject to any cap or restriction imposed by the sponsor. For interagency agreements, use the SI established rate. For certain government and private agreements, an additional 4% management fee applies. OSP will help ensure your budget is accurate. Does the award or gift documentation mention any of the following? A detailed budget, payments to be made based on deliverables produced by SI, a detailed or certified financial report of how funds were spent, a return of unspent funds, a detailed scope of work, approval by the sponsor of significant changes, or of publications, presentations based on the work? If yes, it is likely a sponsored project. If no, it is likely a gift. If the fund's proceeds or revenues from licensing, publishing, or film agreements, royalties, the sale of deaccessioned collection items, concessions, or leases are not the responsibility of Smithsonian Enterprises, then it is likely a contract. If you have any questions, you can always ask OSP or Advancement to help determine how to classify an award. It is in everyone's best interest to classify it correctly. Contact OSP for more information at ospmail@si.edu.